Hello, everyone. Welcome to my tiering of the steel types. This is going to be from the context of a Gen 9 NatDex league with, like, say, Omniterra allowed and, like, your high tier and your low tier Omniterra, all that shit. The usual, like, Smogon rules, but with, like, 11 mons. I'll be considering, like, 8 mon Team Tour context, too, but it's NatDex. Most Team Tours aren't in NatDex, so I'm saying NatDex because, A, I get to, and I'm limiting it to Gen 9 because, A, that's the current meta that I enjoy the most, and B, um, considering other generations is definitely going to affect the placement of a lot of these Pokemon. I want it to be just more static, dependent on a singular meta. So we're going to be, the tiers are the GOAT. This is going to be what I consider to be the best steel type in the tier. The role balance is going to be Pokemon that pull off the offense and the defense on a very, very high level. The defensive profile is for those elite, more steel types that lean more in a defensive angle because it's a defensive steel type. I think that's going to be something you're going to want to more look for in a high tier steel type than rather it be an offensive stalwart. The offensive steel types, though, are obviously very, very good. There's Pokemon that do that on an elite level to the point where they are considered very, very good steel types despite not being drafted primarily to switch into things. B is for those mid tiers that are good at balance, offense, or defense. Also, considering the fact that I'm more of a balanced player, the defensive, I think, to me makes more sense. It just depends on your play style, though. A Kartana is probably better than a Mega Aggron, but for continuity's sake, like it's going to look like I think the Kartana is worse than Mega Aggron, just to spoil that in advance, like something like that. The mid tiers, that's for like your anything from like 9 to like 13 or 12, 9 to like 12 points. That I think are very, very draftable, very, very solid, and just do what you want them to do. The budget options, these are Pokemon that, are like slightly below that threshold or at like that 9 point threshold. Because some of the Pokemon I think that people place higher are worse, but are still draftable. So I wouldn't consider them like as good as like a mid tier that's the same price, but it's still like a solid Pokemon to draft for that reason. Bottom of the barrel, these are Pokemon that you either don't draft like that are lower down on the tier list because they're steel types, so they like do other niches, or are just like steel types that are just really, really bad, but still draftable. Like they're still usable in that role to the point where they have like certain reasons to be picked. As like if it's like your draft's only steel type, it sucks, but it's like squeezable, you know? Most of the Pokemon in this tier aren't going to be that status, but there's a couple that I can think of off the top of my head that are definitely going to be in this tier. And then F is just these Pokemon that are just undraftable, or yeah, just like there's no reason to be picking these as a steal. It's better to just have no steel type than this Pokemon on your team, like a $1 fucking Aeron or something. I'm not going to be tiering like NFEs or I guess like draftable NFEs I'll tier, but not like obviously don't pick a fucking Alolan Diglett. Like that's pretty obvious. So we're going to be getting this started, skipping Sandshrew. Obviously in a little cup context, some of these Pokemon are way better because like Alolan Sandshrew in Little Cup is very, very good. But this is just not in the regular, good old fashioned dicks out Nat decks. And that being said, Alolan Sandslash kicks us off, and I think it's a bottom of the barrel type steal. You don't draft this because it's got a good defensive profile. Ice types never have a good defensive profile. They have a solid enough defensive profile that they're bulky enough to take one hit, or they're very, very offensive. Weavile and Extreme on one end, Glastrier on the other. So this thing is pretty good at as a low tier snow option. I think if something like, well, let's say you don't go G King backs, you go G King bundle, then you can draft this as like a low tier physical option too for that snow. It's fast under snow too, so it can get up like Veil. It's a fast spinner. It gets rocks and spikes. There's like reasons you would pick this. Mostly though, you're getting it for a snow angle and for a low tier Terra Captain. And for that reason, it's like bottom of the barrel draftable, but you don't pick it because it's a steel type. Plain and simple. Except we have a Alolan Dugtrio. It does nothing that you want a Steel type or a Ground type to do. It blocks Volt Switch, but then dies to any coverage move from those Electric types on the next turn. Like, yeah, you're forcing a Thundurus to run Focus Blast, but you're not going to be living it even with a Chobble Berry because you're a fucking Alolan Dugtrio, and you're slower than one of the Thunduruses anyway. They took away the biggest things that Dugtrio had and then made a pile of garbage. They took away Arena Trap and 10 speed and gave it like what 10 defense. Great, awesome. It's going to probably live like a Swanna flip turn now. If you have like some HP investment, that's awesome. So very unusable. Um, for like a point, it functions as a 110 speed option that kind of has offense, and they gave it Swords Dance, so it can be like a Sash Rocker or something, or it can have like Terra. Like you can Terra into like a Ghost type, block the close combat into a KO like a weaker fighting type, for example. But that's just like so niche that I don't think this thing is really worth ever picking, like at all. Next up, we have Magneton, and Magneton is again not picked to be a steal. It's picked because it's a good Terra type, or it's a decent secondary Terra option that traps steals. And Analytic is really strong. It's a solid Scarfer, functions well under Trick Room with Analytic, and has a good offensive profile. But on the whole, it is not picked because it's a steel type. It is picked because it is just offensive and traps other steel types, which is a very good niche. Obviously, Magneton is picked for a reason. I picked Magneton a couple times before. So yeah, I think if you're picking Magneton, it's going to be a secondary steel. It's not going to be your only steel type on a draft, and it's going to serve a purpose. It's going to help your. It's going to aid your offensive fairy. It's going to aid, something that just really likes steel types being gone. So it does that very, very well, though, especially with Terra Access. Next up, we have Fortress. Fortress, to me, is the epitome of a budget steel type. You don't pick this Pokemon as like a first or even a second, maybe not even a third option. There's steel types that are budget that are better. Fortress just has good roles that draft league players look for. It has access to 3 hazards, and those 3 hazards are brought more often than not. I've run spikes on Fortress many, many times. It's decent enough as a rocker. It has sturdy and boots, and it spins once in a while. Like, it's not good at spinning. It doesn't benefit from the speed boost or anything like that. It just spins because it clears hazards, and it doesn't punish ghost types at all. Unless you predict they're switching and you Thunderwave them. That's like the only real value you can get, because payback, more often than not, you're going to get whisked by the steel type coming in, or they're going to set up a sub on your T Wave or Volt Switch, and they're going to get like a setup opportunity, or they're just going to get big chip off on something. You're going to have to break the sub, lose HP on one of your defensive pieces, lose HP on your Fortress to click payback, something or other. It's just not great. It's like it does the jobs, but not very well. It functions way better as a hazard setter than a spinner. I'll just be straight up with you on that, and it pivots into physical attackers. Like if you have a really bad Azu matchup, but you have a Fortress, it's going to come because it checks the Azu for that reason. Just as an example. But Iron Defense Body Press is actually pretty decent on this Pokemon. It's actually okay at doing that because its defensive profile is so good. The typing is nice, and it's got good physical bulk, so you can invest in Spadef and then just like maybe get up an Iron Defense and kill something with Body Press. That's something that, like, for 6 points, it's like good to have that as an option. But obviously, lots of steel types can do that. So many of them, and especially other budget ones, like the next one, Steelix. Steelix to me is a better Pokemon than Fortress. It has 2 roles that it compresses, better than Fortress as a ground type and a steel type. It switches into about the same attacks that Fortress does. It has way better physical bulk, so it's actually a better helmet user. It's a better user of Sturdy because it's actually strong, has good fucking options. It has a better secondary ability than Fortress. When are you ever going to run Overcoat? But Sheer Force, on the other hand, on like a Life Orb offensive Steelix with Trick Room or just something or other, it's just a good option. It has the Fangs, so it actually has moves that benefit from Sheer Force. It has Ice, Fire, and Thunder Fang, and probably other moves that I'm not even thinking of. I haven't drafted Steelix since Usum, but it's probably pretty solid at what it does in that aspect. The item slot's really nice on it. It's a much better rocker because it switches in on those electric types, those high tier electrics. Your Cocos Thundis, your Zapdoses. Your Zapdos is forced to run Heat Wave a lot of the time in the matchup with this Pokemon. You're not picking it as your only steel and your only ground. You're going to be getting probably with this Pokemon a second ground type or a second steel type, depending on what your structure is. Like, let's say you're pairing it with like a Zapdos and a Terra Context, and you're going to want to get a better ground type and then get this maybe as your steel. Just as an example. But that being said, this thing it does a lot. It phases, which Fortress doesn't. It doesn't have that momentum or that spin or those other hazards, but it does the roles that you drafted for better than does Fortress. And for that reason, I think it is definitely a better budget option. And these tiers are going to be ordered. Next up, we have Megalix. Megalix is one of the best budget steals. I've seen this thing on average 6 points, and for 6 points, you get a very solid ground and steel type. You get a very solid rocker. It's pretty much just a level up on Baby Steelix, except for the item slot. That's like a big trade-off, but its bulk is way better, so I think it's actually a much more well-rounded option, even without boots or life orb access or lefties or resist berry. So that slot gets more covered that way. The coverage is good. It's offensively good. With Sand Force up, this thing is very strong. Like your gyro balls are going to be hitting super fucking hard under sand. It's just very good at doing that. So yeah, it's just really good at what it does. It's just a slightly better Steelix, and it's going to be probably one of the top budget options in my opinion. Next up, we have Scizor. Scizor, not really picked for its defensive profile. It's picked because it's got strong bullet punches. It's picked because U-turn is really good stab. It's picked because it's got one weakness. It's like just bulky enough in net decks to be a switch into things, but it's also drafted more as like an SD sweeper or a choice band bullet punch or a decent scarfer or a pursuit trapper. So it does all those roles very well. You're never really going to see like a defog Scizor. Like more often than not, it's going to be like boots or it's going to be like life 4 bullet punch with SD. It's going to be choice banded. It's going to be scarf. It's going to be like maybe even assault vest. It's not going to be. It's especially with roost back. Like getting roost back is good for the defensive profile rather, but you're not really going to ever run this as a defensive piece. You're going to be running it as an offensive piece, and it's very good as an offensive piece. That's why it's so high. Next up, we have Mega Scizor. In my opinion, this is the GOAT in Gen 9 Nat decks. It's in like there's two other Pokemon in my opinion that are like in the conversation for Nat decks GOAT for steals. That would be Mega Mawile and Celesteela. But I put Scizor above those two because of the fact that it forces Terra Prep on a whole nother level. Plus, it actually can recover with Roost. The Roost nerf is really bad for Scizor, but after using this thing in the SGBL Team Tour last season on the Nat deck slot, it is so good at centralizing with Terra banned in that as well, and no Pokemon getting hidden power. I in this Mega Scizor mirror, mine was like a big threat to him, and his was a big threat to me. This thing is just so solid that it's not even funny. Like you can invest very heavily in the bulk, and it'll still hit really hard with the bullet punches because of Technician, and then U-turn is stab. So it's just like you can run a U-turn bullet punch roost knockoff set or something, and it's very solid. It functions very well in that SD slot. It's just its baby form, but better. Its defensive profile is amazing. It's way above anything that's going to be in the A tier. I can tell you that much. Maybe. Like the fact that it balances the roles means that it's probably not going to be as good of a solid like pure defensive Pokemon. And I don't think you should draft this thing and centralize it as like a defensive steel type. I think you should get supporting offensive and supporting defensive pieces with this thing. It forces Terra Fire a lot of the time, so if you get like an offensive water type, like a Urshifu Rapid, a high tier offensive water type, like an Urshifu Rapid, a Greninja, something of that nature, it's going to partner extremely well with this. Or you get something that struggles with fairy types, like an Urshifu Single, and it's going to partner really well with this too. Or you could get something that also struggles with fire types, and then they'll break for each other, like a Galar Darm. Like this, it's just a very good Pokemon. It partners with everything, and it learns Defog, so that's also really nice. Next up, we have Scarm. Scarm, I think we can stop kidding ourselves. Scarm is a mid tier. Scarm is not the A minus Pokemon or the A tier defensive steel type that it was like 3 generations ago. Even then, like honestly, in my opinion, like it's just barely A tier in those gens. Its bulk is power crept, very very hard in Gen 9 Nat decks, but that being said, it has still got one of the best defensive typings in the game. It still stacks rocks and spikes very effectively because it can switch in on those physical attackers and get up a hazard, or it can defog. Even though it's passive, it gets toxic back in this as well. So it can poison whatever comes in, like the defensive answer. Brave Bird is high DPS. It's like really, really good damage. It's a high base power move coming off this thing. It has like 80 attack. It actually hits it. It actually hits pretty decently. In my opinion, this Pokemon is very good. The lack of U-turn, though, is definitely starting to show. You don't want this thing on the field for too long, and if it is going to be on the field for too long, it's probably getting hit down to Sturdy and whirlwinding or countering something. It's a pretty decent phaser. Sturdy, again, it's one of those sturdy steel types. We've covered, what, fucking 3 of them so far? I guess 3.5, because Mega Steelix will probably run it before it Megas. I know Magneton gets sturdy too, so that's actually 4. this thing to me does it the worst, but it is still effective. It's a good tool. It's good for like a +6 Mega Mawile. You get hit with the Thunder Punch, you counter, you kill it, something like that. It's a very effective user of resistance berries. Like an Aqua Berry lets you take like a special fire move, and you can kind of like force something out and get Rock's Chip. Um, it's still got its niche for sure in that decks, but it is obviously starting to get power crept way, way, way down further. It's never going to be undraftable, but it is definitely not a good Pokemon, as good as it used to be. It's like a really solid 10, 11 point option, in my opinion, in that decks for sure. Regular Mawile, undraftable. The only thing it has going for it is that it's a fairy and it doesn't even switch in on dragon types because they'll just click flamethrower and one shot it, or like earthquake and kill it. Intimidate's nice, but it's a Mawile. It's got really bad stats. It's just not worth talking about more than that. It's definitely worse than Dougie even. But then its Mega is one of the best Pokemon in the game. Just impossible to switch into. Find me something that does. Rotom Heat, you get hit with Stone Edge. You can Stone Edge those fire types. Fire Fang those steel types, Brick Break those steel types, knock off those other bulky options that can switch in potentially long term. It gets Thunder Punch for stuff like Skarmory and Celesteela. It just has everything. Honestly, it's got such a good toolbox. It's got a defensive toolbox too. It's got slow momentum from Baton Pass. It's got knockoff. It's got rocks. It's got Super Fang. It's got a good defensive profile. Sucker Punch is really strong. Swords Dance sets are obviously as good as they've always been. You can invest in this thing bulk wise or speed wise and not really worry about it. Like, it's bulky enough to where if you're just max HP or max attack, max speed, like Adamant, you're going to still take a big hit and you're going to kill something back, or you're going to be, you can invest in this defensively like Max Spadef, take a really, really convincing hit from, like, say, I don't know, a Mega Gardevoir. You can take two Hyper Voices. You can take a Hyper Voice into a Mystical Fire if you're Spadef potentially. Just off the top of my head, I don't know. No hazards up. And the Gardevoir is timid, let's say. You can maybe take a Hyper Voice into a Mystical Fire if you're Mega already switching in, if you're Spadef, and then kill it back with an Iron Head, and you don't need that investment to kill it. If it's like a Fizdef Gardevoir even, that's probably more realistic. That's just an example, I guess. It just gets such good coverage, and it's you can get very fancy with the EV spreads. I think this Pokemon is inarguably in GOAT contention, but it is just below Mega Scizor in my opinion for that, and this Pokemon should pretty much be near max point value every single draft. Next up, we have, I guess we can call Lairon like one of those usable NFEs. I think it's like bad. It gets like Endeavor Sturdy, and that's kind of cool, I guess. The typing is just really awful, and not really worth talking about more than that. It gets rocks, whatever. Like, draft Lairon if you want. I don't really care. You can go ahead and be that guy. Then we got Aggron, which to me is definitely bottom of the barrel. It's like teetering on undraftable, but it is so strong. It functions as a low tier Scarfer, a sturdy rocker, head smash, choice band abuser. If you have like Trick Room or something, this thing can maybe like tear up a matchup and your opponent would like under prep for it with its good coverage. And but you're not drafting it because it's a steel type. You'll draft it as like a low tier secondary steel type for some key resistances to like flying or pretty much just flying or ice that I can think of. But it's other type, like rock drops it down horribly defensively, so you're only pretty much going to be getting it to resist flying because of that quad resistance. That being said, Choice Banded Head Smash is so strong, and Rock Cut is such a nice addition to its toolkit that I think it's definitely draftable. For sure. Just don't make this your steel type, like your only steel type. What you can make your only steel type is its parent, and that is Mega Aggron. And this Pokemon, I see this thing at 10 and 11 points. To me, this is a 14-point Pokemon, 15-point. It should be in that sort of tier list, range on a tier list, because this thing switches into every physical attack on the fucking planet and doesn't get 2-hit KO'd more often than not. Like, there's so many Pokemon that this just switches into. It can Iron Defense on special attackers a lot of the time because you're going to be running Spadef most of the time, or like an offensive max attack set, because its Fizdef is so high, and Filter makes those weaknesses very, very much so nerfed. It has 3 weaknesses: fire, steel, fighting. Sorry, fire, ground, fighting. Those latter 2 types are more often than not physical, and if you do want to invest in this thing's Fizdef, it can switch in on like Zygarde. Like a +6 Zygarde is not. I don't even think +6 Zygarde is going to 2-hit KO a fucking Fizdef Aggron. Like, and it's going to die to 2 avalanches. Like, this thing gets coverage for everything. It's so good. It's if you get it with like a really good Wish Passer, like you pair this with an Alomomola, it just gets 10 times better too. You're going to be healing this thing up often. You're going to be switching it in. It's going to take the hit, go back to full, and then check the Pokemon after that. Without Wish, it still functions for sure. it functions as a steel type even without support. It is, in my opinion, I've started calling this Pokemon the Ting-Lu prototype because it just does everything Ting-Lu does but worse, except set up spikes. But it phases, it has coverage, it has setup, it gets hone claws, it gets rock polish, it gets iron defense body press, raw body press from this thing. It hits so hard. It gets counter, it gets metal burst, it gets fucking like it just gets everything. It gets coverage out the wazoo, it gets the elemental punches, avalanche, earthquake, rock moves. It's just so solid, so slept on, so underrated. I think this Pokemon is definitely extremely draftable and should be more expensive in that dex. I am very astounded seeing this thing around 12 points and not being picked. Um, yeah, to me, it's just very good. Metang is probably the best of the undraftable steel types so far. As an NFE, it really, actually, I'm going to check Showdown real quick and see if this thing got knockoff because I'm actually not 100% sure. Let's go ahead and open this up. We'll find out together. It did not. So it's not good, but it is still like pickable. Like with the Violite, the stats are like fine, and the defensive typing is good enough. You'll see soon enough that we've got two pretty good Steel Psychics coming up. You can pick it as like a fairy switch in, and it gets like priority. It gets rocks, so it's like it can switch in and sponge hits. It's like it's a one pointer for sure, but it's like not. It's better than the three below it for sure. Except we have Metagross. This Pokemon is like the best mid-tier steel type, I think. It's like it does both defense and offense well. It's a good balance pick. The setup agility sets to start with, because of the move buffs, it gets Heavy Slam, Psychic Fang, Stone Edge, and Knockoff now. Those are very good additions to its toolkit. A reliable Psychic Stab, a stronger Rock option to hit those birds, and have something else other than Earthquake for the fire types. Obviously, Heavy Slam is very good. A lot of the time, it's like going to run Meteor Mash still because of the attack boost and the fact that Heavy Slam is not super high power into a lot of things. And if it's not full base power, it's going to be worse than Meteor Mash. But still a very nice tool. And obviously, Knockoff makes those stealth rocking defensive sets a lot better. It makes Assault Vest a lot better. It does a lot of good things. Still has Pursuit access if your league doesn't ban that. In my opinion, Pursuit shouldn't be banned. So I think that definitely makes Metagross way better, especially as an AV user. It's a good mid-tier rocker. It just does a lot of things. It's got very well-rounded stats. You can run like a Choice Banded set, and it's kind of like a mini Scizor a little bit in that aspect. It gets Hone Claws to set up. It gets Agility. Weakness Policy is really good, and then obviously Clear Body is awesome. So, in my opinion, probably the best mid-tier Steel type that you can get on a team. Next up, we have Registeel. I'm not going to be counting things that should be banned. Obviously, this is a banned Pokemon in every NatDex league, unless you're Ubers. But Registeel, on the other hand, it's teetering on either of these tiers. I'm going to go ahead and put it at the bottom of mid-tier because it should be like a 10, 11 point Pokemon because you get Counter, Seismic Toss, and Toxic Back. And those are very, very, very pivotal tools. If we're talking PAL decks, it's a very good, decent budget option. But since we're talking Nat decks, you have like Thunder Wave, you have Toxic, you have Seismic Toss, Counter. It can break. It gets S-Toss for those setup mons that have sub, and then it has coverage for a lot of the Pokemon that get up that will try to sub in front of it. The only real exceptions I can think of are like fat ghosts that are immune to sub, or like high-tier ghosts that are immune to sub, because you don't get special coverage for them. And so like your Dragapult is going to sub and Wisp, and then all of a sudden Ice Spinner's not breaking its sub anymore. Shadow Claw's not going to be breaking the Spectre sub anymore. Heavy Slam even, because Heavy Slam is a good tool for this Pokemon. Ice Spinner is nice because you'll be doing more damage to those high-tier grounds, stuff like your Landas and your Chomps. Even like your Menses, your dragons aren't going to be setting up on this at all, especially because you block Intimidate with Clear Body. It's a very good sponge. It's like mini Mega Aggron, but Mega Aggron is not as passive as Registeel is. The Iron Defense Body Press sets are obviously very solid too. Those can be pretty centralizing. I've seen those do plenty of work in my friends' leagues. In my friend leagues, rather, it's just very solid at doing that too. It just sponges everything and is just a really, 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 really solid mid tier. Definitely worse than like a Skarmory, but very much draftable at the 10-point range, 9-point range, even the 8-point range. I've seen it as low as fucking 6 in that deck. So I'm like, what? No way. And then it gets picked, and it comes to games, and people run Terra on it, and it's pretty solid, to be honest. Moving on from that, though, this might be kind of a hot take in a NatDex context. In PAL decks, like Jirachi keeps dropping in price, and I think it's still getting power crept in NatDex too, but I still think Jirachi is really solid. I think it's like a good 15, 14 point Pokemon to be picking. I think 16 is honestly where it should be because it still does everything that it's always been doing. The Pixie Bulk is so nice. It's still really good, well rounded. Offensively, it leaves a lot to be desired, but that's where your Cosmic Power, Stored Power sets, your Calm Mind, Super still come into play, even without Hidden Power. It's still got coverage. It's got Volt Beam. It's got I guess Icy Wind really doesn't count, but you know. The dual stab is nice. It gets stuff like Aura Sphere and Moonblast. You don't have to run the shiny shit anymore. The offensive sets are still solid. I like Cosmic Power, Weakness Policy, Store Power is so good, and it's still a really good defensive piece too. If this is your defensive steal, it's a Jirachi. It's still doing that very effectively. You know, it's a good Scarfer. You know, you're forcing Covert Cloak. If you're forcing Covert Cloak, then like that's really good for you. Because then you're not running boots. If you put this on like a hazard stack team, it forces item slots. It gets up screens. It's a really solid user of Healing Wish. I think it still is a very effective balancing role Pokemon. It's a role balancer, and I think this Pokemon is insanely elite. I honestly, it's boring, sure, but it does what it does really, really well. It's a Jirachi, in fact. It will always be good. I think always, always, always super draftable. Next up, we have Empoleon. This is it's hard to say which is better between these two. I'll say Empoleon because it does the roll compression a little bit better. It's a pivot. It has really bad Formula syndrome though. Getting Roost back, getting Toxic back are really nice, but then that's even more coverage that you have to fit. It's hard to fit all of knockoffs. Oh, it gets Scald back too, by the way. That's really good, I think. That definitely boosts it above Skarmory, actually, now that I think about it. But it's hard to fit stuff like Roar, Defog, Scald, Flip Turn, Roost, Rocks, Knockoff, Ice Beam, Coverage, Flash Cannon, Aqua Jet. Like the offensive weakness policy sets are very good. It's bulky enough to be able to take those super effective hits, agility of, and then kill at least two Pokemon. But on that same note, it is also very, very much so. The defensive sets are very pressured to come up with four moves every matchup. More often than not, you see like a Roar, a Roost, Rocks, Flip Turn, just to make sure you can actually like stop those setup threats from coming in on you. Toxic is very hard to fit. Knockoff is very hard to fit. Scald is very hard to fit. It's just it struggles with so much because it's tasked to do so much. If you draft it in a defensive role, you're gonna find yourself pretty overwhelmed pretty fast. To be honest, with options, and it's gonna probably cause you to lose games. It does the defensive role effectively, but it is just so hard to it's so hard to fit everything that you need that I think Empoleon is just it's mid tier solidly, but it's a solid mid tier for sure. It's draftable, and that much can definitely be said. Next up, we have Bastiodon. It's bottom of the barrel purely because it's a really good budget Terra Captain. You get this thing out of that Rock Steel typing, and then all of a sudden your Iron Defense Body Press sets, or Terra Dark Foul Play, or stuff like Roar, like it's fat, and it's really good at being a Terra Captain for like 1 or 2 points. Um, it's it's still worse than these other Pokemon though. I can't really justify putting it high, but you know, Terra makes this Pokemon actually very much so draftable for 1 or 2 points. That being said, you're probably never going to Terra it, but it does what it does for sure. Next up, we have Wormadam. Yep, it's a Wormadam. All right, next up we have Bronzor. This is another semi-draftable NFE little cut Pokemon. I guess Wormadam is fine because it gets like rocks and whatever the fuck else. It Quiver Dances, Flash Cannons, and Mega Diancie for 96%. That's good. And then we have Bronzor. It just like kind of pivots in and is really passive. You know, for a point, it's like something that you can definitely pick, but it's not very good. Like you're not going to be bringing it, and in odds are it's not going to be your only steel type. You're picking it because you want resistances. All right, next up we have Bronzong. Bronzong is definitely a mid tier. It is the epitome of a mid tier steel. Actually, I think it's worse than Registeel. In fact, actually, I think it's a budget option. Bronzong has been getting so power creeped in PAL decks alone. Nat decks is like you get those immunity, you get that ground immunity, and it's awesome. But Registeel is still going to be taking ground hits. Like a Shucker Registeel will counter and kill a offensive ground like a Garchomp. What's Bronzong doing back? I've seen some creative sets, especially from Jay's Eyes. Thank you for showing me how cool Bronzong can be. and it compresses. It's a decent rocker. It's immune to ground. You can resist fire definitely with heat proof. It's actually pretty good at that. It's got a good defensive profile, but it's not doing anything back. It's going to poison and maybe get up Trick Room. OTR sets are still pretty okay. It's just super, super weak. Like Gyro Ball is nice, but it's just like it's got like 90 attack, 80 special attack. It's just not strong enough to be pulling up those Life Orb OTR sets anymore. It's not It's not DPP anymore. This thing is just like it's good enough to be picked for sure, but I just don't think it's like a budget steel type. It's the best of the budget steels easily. I don't know. I can't think of any budget steels that are going to be above this, but it's just not. It's just not what you want really out of your Pokemon slot anymore. It's definitely starting to get power crept further and further down the tier list. Next up, we have Lucario. Lucario is a mid-tier steel, and I'm tired of pretending that it's not. This thing offensively is so strong in a matchup, especially with Terra. As a mid-tier Terra, this thing is exceptional. It's got coverage, like you can do nasty. It's literally, sorry, I just get so overwhelmed talking about this thing. It is, in my opinion, the best budget offensive steel type. I don't think there's very many really to choose from, but it is the best for sure. It's got priority, 3 different forms, Nasty Plot and Swords Dance. It's one of the true mixed attackers left over in the game, and it does it super well. It's very strong on both sides. You can run a Specs set with like Specs Terra Fighting Vacuum Wave, banned with Terra Normal E-Speed. It's like budget D-Knight in that aspect. It's got good coverage and Terra Blast access. It's a very good mid-tier Terra Captain, and I've seen it getting tiered at like 9 points, and being able to Terra this thing for 9 points and getting something like an Ogerpon with it, that's like insane. In my opinion, it's pretty fucking good. So this should be banned. Next up, we have Magnezone. Magnezone is another mid tier. I would definitely place it above Registeel because it is Magneton, but better. We're reaching a point. I used to think Magneton was better than this because of the extra speed. And I used to not like Magnezone really at all. But it actually traps this steel type super effectively, and with Terra, you can get out of that typing and be immune to like ground, trap those steel types with Terra Fire, Terra Blast. It's like a very, very decent 9 point, 8 point steel type to choose. Its defensive profile is pretty solid. It's got sturdy, it's got analytics, so you can, again, functions very well in Trick Room, pivots around, has a good defensive profile. It's a very solid Assault Vest user. I still think Magnezone definitely has merit to be chosen. I definitely hate this thing way too much. I have overhated this thing way too much. It's definitely worse than Registeel because Registeel is roll compression. Like it's a rocker that switches in and sponges every hit. Magnezone switches in and sponges and is like specs and is hard to switch into, and it's a pretty decent Scarfer. It's super slow, but it is definitely a draftable mid tier. Very, very solid. For sure, for sure. Probopass goes above Aggron because I think it is I definitely think this Pokemon is like amazing as a Terramon. To be honest, like its defensive profile is super solid if you get access to Terra Ghost, better definitely than Probopass because you get that Volt Switch. That Volt Switch option opens up a lot. It has pretty much the same moves besides like Foul Play, and it's obviously a little like slightly stronger. So the Volt Switch option opens it up so much more that I think it is definitely better than the other 2 Rock Steels as a draftable low tier Terra Captain. Although actually no, Terra Rock Head Smash is really strong, so it's actually worse than Aggron, but it does that pretty well. Next up, Roll Balance Incarnate. We got Heatran. Heatran's so good. With Hidden Power Band as well. Heatran is one of those steel types that, in my opinion, if you draft it, it's like a top 3 Pokemon on your team every time. There's a lot of things that it's better than, and I think it's definitely being power crept down. Getting Toxic back is so nice. It's not even funny, especially for those Magma Taunt sets. You know, it actually lets you beat Bulky Waters. Like a Slowking loses 1v1 to a Heatran because you got Taunt, Toxic, Magma Storm, and it's so fat that it takes those hits. But you can run offensive sets. Eruption coming back in that decks for like Scarf sets, it's huge. It's got good coverage. It's got like Power Gem and such now. Pretty much just Power Gem, but it is such a nice tool to punish those fat fire types. Those fire types that are going to want to switch in on you and that have like ground coverage. It's just a nice tool. It stops Volcarona from setting up on you with an accurate rock move. You know, it's just really solid. Heatran is just super nice as a steel type. I think it's probably worse in Paldea decks, but in Nat decks, it is still a super solid option that I think is for a 15, 16 point Pokemon, very good, has such a good profile. You can go offensive or defensive with a Heatran, and it will not disappoint you either way. After Heatran, we have Drill, and the A tiers are looking pretty fucking empty right now, but I think Drill just is. It does both, honestly. It's a very good ground and steel type, and its defensive stats are super good because of its HP. It doesn't leave a lot to be desired either way. If you're drafting it on sand, offensively, this thing is very centralizing, especially with Terra. If you're drafting it defensively, it's got very good resistances. It switches in on those electrics. It switches in on those fairies. It switches in on everything and threatens it out. Flying types are an issue for it, but they always will be. That's why you have like 10 other Pokemon or 8 other Pokemon. It's just like a very solid piece on a team and always and will never disappoint you. I think this Pokemon, especially with Terra access, is very strong and a very good option for the 14, 17 point range. Very, very good at that aspect. SCAV is next. I think SCAV is definitely another budget steel type. It really only functions as a breaker or an assault vest low tier option that has pursuit access. You don't really draft this thing. You can draft it as a defensive piece because it's pretty bulky, and obviously it's a good steel type that switches into a lot of fairies. It doesn't have rocks, which sucks, but it is super strong and is definitely like a draftable Pokemon. Like let's say you have like an Excadrill and you draft an SCAV as your low tier steel. I think that's a very good combination of Pokemon, for example. So you're not leaning into your Excadrill to be your only offensive piece at that, or switch into every fairy type in the game. You can have your Escavalier do that for you too. It definitely does that extremely well. Next up, we have Ferrothorn. Ferrothorn, very good defensive steel type. Been very good for over 14 years now. This thing just in singles, it does those defensive sets very, very well. And Iron Defense Body Press is just another tool for Ferrothorn. I will always be drafting Ferrothorn. You will see me with like there's a like higher than 50% chance that I'll be drafting Ferrothorn a lot of the time if I can. It's just that good. Getting toxic. It has toxic, T-Wave, spikes, rocks. It does everything Skarmory does, but better, except for phasing. And it's strong enough, whereas Skarmory's not, to break the subs on those Pokemon or stop a lot of setup threats with the really strong Gyro Ball or a very good Body Press or a T-Wave or a Toxic, which is something Skarmory can't do. So I like to compare these two because they came out like they've definitely been like consistently OU for around the same amount of time, but Ferrothorn has just been such a level up. The defensive typing is so nice. It's not weak to ground. The quad weakness to fire is okay. Like you can run an Aqua Berry, mitigate that, and then like paralyze the fire type and then switch out. It functions really well as a lure too. It just does all of those. It does all of those things very well. So it's solid enough to where I think it's just like A tier for sure. And it's actually better than Aggron. I don't know why I'm thinking it's not. Next, we got Ferroseed. This is an undraftable, but it is definitely better than like Metang and all these other ones because of Spike's access and the fact that it has knockoff. That's really all I have to say. Gyro Ball's nice too, and it switches into like electric types. That's pretty much it. Next up, we have Klinklang. It's definitely bottom of the barrel. If it had Terra Blast excess, it would actually be like decent. To be honest, like you'd be able to run like a Terra Fire and break through other steel types or a Terra Electric Wild Charge and be like Scarf or whatever. It is a good low tier Terrabond for sure because the setup sets are still really solid and it's got that steel typing and it's really bulky, and it's got stuff like Trick Room. Like it's got like underrated aspects, underexplored, and it is a steel type for sure. It like switches into a lot of things and offensively threatens stuff with Gear Grind and Shift Gear and all of that, but you're drafting it not as your steel type. You're drafting it as a low tier offensive threat, or you're drafting it to pivot into things and for its resistances and that sort of profile that comes from its typing. But you're not drafting it because it's a steel type. And for that reason, I definitely have it as a bottom of the barrel. Better than these other ones. I think you can argue that it's worse than Sandslash for sure. I think it is a little bit worse because Sandslash still has the rock spin and spike aspect, and it's very good on snow teams. Next up, we have Stunfisk G. I'm actually going to put it at the bottom of the barrel because it's still got that typing, and it's got like it's got rocks access. A lot of the upper tier electrics are going to have to run coverage just to hit this. Like you're going to have to run your heat waves and focus blasts and stuff, and your nature's madnesses and all of that sort of thing because it still switches in on them pretty decently because it is still a Stunfisk but worse. Next up, we have Pawniard. Again, don't draft it, but it is like fine. It's got like knockoff. It's got like priority. It's a dark type. It does what it does pretty decently. So Not much to really say. It's a Pawniard. Next up, we have, okay, this I think does go above Bronzong. Bisharp is a very good budget option in that decks because you have Pursuit, you have the Eviolate. It's a good defensive type. Steel Dark is actually pretty decent defensively. You resist like Ghost. You resist you don't resist Fairy, but with the Violet, you basically do. You're still immune to like poison and shit. You resist Dark is the one I was trying to find. And it's a very good Terra Captain. Like as a mid-tier Terra, this thing is like amazing. Because like Terra Fire, Terra Fairy, Terra Water, Terra Flying, all of these types that work on this thing with Terra Blast access and the fact that it's so strong, you can get up an SD with the Violate, and then you threaten Terra Dark Sucker Punches. You can set up in front of shit. It's like obviously it's like King Gambit. It's like a mid tier King Gambit because it evolves into King Gambit. So gets rocks. It's got a good defensive profile, and it's a very solitaire captain. Very much so a good budget option. Durant is next. It is a budget option through and through. I think it's in between the Steelixes. We finally found something to separate them. It's not defensive at all. It's a purely offensive budget steel type option, and it does that very well. It's a very good physical breaker. It functions pretty well with Terra. Defensively, you can run like Terra Fire and stop getting killed by fire types. You can run water. You can run rock. Hit really hard with those stone edges. Offensively, the stabs are good offensively. Hustle is really nice. It's a good Scarfer. It does a lot of good things offensively for your team. It doesn't get rocks, which kind of sucks, but it still has very good offensive profile. Cobalion's next. Cobalion is a mid-tier. It is better, in my opinion, than Registeel, even probably better than Skarmory, to be honest with you. Definitely not better than Empoleon, though. We will stop that train right here. Actually, you know what? Fuck it. It is better than Empoleon because you got that momentum. You got that high speed tier. Offensively, the Iron Defense, Body Press, Sets, Calm Mind, and SD are all valid options. In fact, it is better than Lucario. Probably the second best steel on this tier. The only real bop against it, and in my opinion, the real reason to not pick it as your only steel type is the fact that it's weak. That's like a big thing. You get those high base power moves, your CCs and Focus Blasts, has Aura Sphere access and has pretty good coverage, but 90 attacking stats are really bad if you're not Bandit Specs or Calm Mind SD/Iron Defense. But the defensive profile with access to T-Wave now and the fact that you get like Iron Defense, it's just very, very solid. I think it's a very good mid-tier steel. And the other main knock against it is the fact that it doesn't resist Fairy, which is a huge reason you draft steel types. So in my opinion, that does end up being a big knock against it. And but I still think it has a better profile than these four, and is a balance. So to me, that makes it a little bit better than Lucario. Next up, we have Doublade. Doublade is a budget option, and I honestly think it's an underrated budget option. It is super knockoff prone, which sucks, but for like 4 or 5 points, which I've been seeing it at, the defensive typing, in my opinion, is the second best or arguably best in the game with all of those resistances. It's knockoff bait, but it's so physically bulky that 2 knockoffs isn't really going to ever kill it. It gets up SDs for free. It's got very good priority and sneak. It's a very solid low tier spin blocker. Still switches in on those fairy types if you invest in its Spadef fully. Pretty much have to fully to be able to take like a Mystical Fire, but you threaten them out with Gyro Ball or Iron Head. Again, it sets up SDs effectively. It's a good Trick Room abuser. It does a lot of good things in one role, and in my opinion, it's still very much draftable. As I've picked it many times in the past and have never been disappointed by this thing, and can definitely say that with authority. Next up, we have Aegislash. You would think it would go up here, but in my opinion, it's definitely fallen off over time. And it gets drafted more as an offensive steal. And I think it's actually worse than Scizor. Reason being, the typing is amazing, the priority is amazing, the coverage is amazing. But once you get out of that form and your opponent predicts like the King Shield to come out and they set up on you and take advantage of you that way, with your reduced defenses and your reduced offenses that they nerfed in between, I think it was Gen 8 and 9, or no, 7 and 8, this Pokemon becomes way worse. King Shield is still a really solid move, but this thing obviously doesn't have a lot of the options that the higher tier steals have. Offensively, though, it's a very solid piece. It gets Swords Dance, and we'll be able to set up Swords Dances like the baby that I just talked about very much effectively, and King Shield is still really nice. So the priority is still really strong, and weakness policy autotomized sets are still very good, though, in that dex. It's just not super draftable outside of those roles. I still think it's very good, but it has its problems for sure. Next up is Hisui Sliggoo. I actually think this is definitely draftable for sure, especially as like a lower tier Terra captain. Like those curse sets, those Iron Defense, Acid Armor, Body Press sets. It's being able to Terra out of the Dragon Steel typing is fine too. It adds some good stuff to a team. It's a low tier water resist, low tier dragon type. You know, it can phase. It sponges special hits pretty effectively. It does all of that really nicely. And I think those roles are very nice to have. And I think it's very much draftable for like a 2-point, 3-point option, and especially as a Terra captain. Next up, we have Hisui Gudra, another mid tier. This thing is a very good sponge, but it doesn't have a lot of the same utility as the skills above it. So I think it is probably suited for this tier. It doesn't have momentum with like stuff like Empoleon, Cobalion, or Magnezone have. It is better than Magnezone because it's a much better sponge. And the Iron Defense Body Press sets are very good. Rest Talk sets, and its coverage is just really solid. It's got a very colorful move pool, but the profile is nice defensively, but it doesn't recover without rest, and that kind of sucks too. So very good here. It doesn't resist fairy either, which means physical fairy types are a big problem for it. Klefki is next. Klefki, very solid mid-tier steel type. It's just not bulky enough anymore, really, to be extremely valuable. But you know, priority screens, priority spikes, and priority T-wave are all really nice tools. So it's around this range. I think actually it is a better defogger than Skarmory, to be honest, because you get priority. It's like a last ditch clear the hazard so that my offensive threat can come in and not die and live, sort of thing, without really having Healing Wish. So I think Klefki is very good in that aspect. Definitely a very draftable mid-tier for like 9-10 points. Next up is Togedemaru, bottom of the barrel. No spikes access, but it's got a decent defensive typing and profile to where it is definitely much more draftable than a lot of these Pokemon. Probably, honestly, better than Magneton sometimes because it's got like Super Fang and stuff, and it pivots better than Magneton does. It has a better defensive profile, so it's probably the best of these Pokemon for sure. Next up, we have Celesteela. I don't need to sing the praises of Celesteela. I just got 20 kills with it in the last IPL season. It does everything. The typing alone is so good in that dex. Your weakness policy sets are so nice. It pairs perfectly with all of the high tier dragons and everything else. It's still so good from Yusum. Its defensive profile is amazing. Resist berries are so good on it, and autotomized sets still sweep, and it's just still so good. Then you know it's role balance incarnate. It balances everything super fucking well. So that is my opinion on Celesteela, that it is literally another contender for NetDex GOAT. And I think that that's a fair assessment. Next up, we have Cart. Cart has, I mean, it's Kartana, right? You don't draft it because it's a steel type. You don't draft it to switch into things defensively. You draft it because it sweeps matchups on its own, especially if you don't ban Terra on it. If you don't ban Terra on it, I'm playing a Terra Kartana this week. This Pokemon is a threat with Terra. It's got like Terra Normal Return or Giga Impact or whatever, and then like Leaf Blade, Knockoff, all that stuff becomes a lot more threatening. There's really not much to say. It's the best Scarfer in the game. Its Swords Dance sets are fucking insane. It knocks off the switch-ins and then chips them after their boots are gone. The switch-ins aren't switch-ins long term. You know, you can bring this in mid-game, remove items, and then set up a late game with it, and it's just so good at doing that. So I can't not sing the praises of Kartana. That one is such a centralizing thing that it's not even funny. Next up is Stakataka. I think it's a very draftable mid-tier if you make it a Terra Captain. And because it's so good as a Terra Captain, I think it ranks above these guys. If you don't make it a Terra Captain, it's still pretty decent. Like it's got like the Trick Room stuff going on, but you still got that really shitty typing. But the Gyro Balls are still so strong that it's not even funny. There's really not much more detail to say. It's very good with Terra. Without Terra, it functions okay. It becomes a much better defensive piece with Terra as well. You can run like Terra Water on the Stealth Rocking set, and it's like pretty decent defensively. It's like just a fat, bulky Vizdev Water. So we don't really have many of those. So with Terra, it just does a lot of things. But like Terra Steel Gyro Balls under Trick Room are unguardable. Like just straight up unguardable unless you have certain Pokemon on your team. Melmetal's next. Melmetal, balance. Again, with Terra, this Pokemon becomes insanely strong. I actually think it's probably better than those three. I still think Celesteela is the GOAT, but that's just me. Yeah, non-Mega GOAT, rather. This thing is very strong. Choice band sets only really get checked by Helmet Waters, and Helmet Waters are pretty exploitable. You can run Punching Glove with a lot of its coverage moves, Double Iron Dash, plus Elemental Punches. It gets coverage like Earthquake, Rock Slide, and Darkest Lariat. It still hits super fucking hard, and Toxic Protect sets are good. It gets T-Wave to punish switch-ins as well. Just a very solid steel type that switches in and sponges and then hits super fucking hard. It's a Melmetal. I mean, it's pretty brainless, for sure. It's like Dracovish, but way better. Next up, we have Corviknight, and I'm a Corviknight hater personally, but I have to acknowledge the fact that it has that defensive profile in that dex. Those screen sets, it's a pretty good screen setter and a pretty good pivot. You're never really going to want to run Defog with Corviknight, but and those Iron Defense body press sets are actually pretty good in that dex. Like Nat Dex is much more balanced and less offensive in my opinion than Paldex, and for that reason, I think Corviknight's actually better in that dex than Paldex. I'm still not like a big fan of the Pokemon, but it's a good pivot. It's usually like a budget option, although I've seen it like within the 14, 15 point range, maybe as low as 12, so that would make it a mid tier objectively. But I think the defensive profile is good on it, and it's like underpriced. I think it's like an A tier solid steel type in that dex. It's got like taunt, it's got defog, it's got like pivot stuff, it's got screens, it's just got a lot of good things going for it. And it's a threat in the builder for sure. You have to consider it. You need coverage for it a lot of the time. It's like very centralizing. So I think for those reasons, it's a pretty good steel type in that dex. Berserker's bad. With Terra, it's like draftable, but definitely worse than all these other guys. It's got like Terra Blast and like really strong Iron Heads and shit. So it's worth picking up as like a 1.2 point Terra Captain, and it gets rocks too, which is kind of nice. So it's got things going for it, but it's really not worth talking about because it is a Berserker after all. Then we got Copperajah. Copperajah is definitely a budget steel type. It's like a low tier rocker. It's not bulky enough to switch in long term to things unless you're AV. And if you're AV, you don't have rocks or you don't have choice band. It functions the best under Trick Room or with like an offensive set leaning into it, especially with Sheer Force. It's got very colorful coverage. So it does a lot of things for like 5 points. But beyond that, there's really not much reason to be picking it. It's like a usable steel type for sure, but not insanely amazing. It's just fine. It's better in my opinion than like a Steelix, which is probably too low. It's like a good budget option, like a Steelix or whatever. But I just actually think it's probably the worst of these Pokemon. Just because it's not super bringable to many matchups, it doesn't function like super well as that in that defensive role. I'm moving SCAV down because I'm realizing now the defensive profile on these guys is better than SCAVs, and not having Rocks access is a pretty big boon against it. And Bronzong is still like better than a lot of these guys. Mega Steelix, I think, is probably better than Bronzong. It's pretty arguable. I'll keep it there, though, just to not be controversial. Next up, we have Duraludon, which is definitely gotten a big glow up since getting a Violite. It's a really good low tier Phys Def Pokemon that can switch in on things and gets up rocks pretty reliably. Vulnerable to knockoff, but even then, like, you're still bulky enough. It was functioning without a Violite, and it was kind of draftable last gen, and now it's definitely pickable in like that 4 to 6 point range. Very very decent. Next up, we have Tinkatuff, which is fine. It gets knock and resists a lot of hits. It's got a good, very steel defensive profile, so it's better than all these other undraftables, but still very much so not good. For sure, definitely don't pick it as like your only fairy or steel. Get it if you need the defensive profile, but otherwise don't. Tinkaton is the best mid tier steel type, and I cannot stress how good this Pokemon is. It does both. It can run SD sets with Gigaton and threaten a lot of matchups. It gets Encore, it gets Knockoff, it gets Thunder Wave. It's got the typing, it's got everything. It's got everything that you're looking for in a mid tier steel. It's got that defensive profile. The only issue is a lot of people lean on it way too much. I'm guilty of this myself, and I've dropped Tinkaton in the past a few times because I've leaned too much into it on my drafts. That being said, I'm always looking to put it on my teams. And don't get it as your only fairy and steel. Get another fairy, get another steel, whichever you think benefits your team more. But it does both roles. It just can't do everything. It compresses super, super well in like 8-mon formats, for example. Like every single team in Draft League World Cup, 20 Tinkatons got taken. Like it's extremely good. And don't sleep on it. It is the best mid-tier steel type easily. It fits on every team. There's always an angle to pick this thing. Except we have the car. Revavroom is budget, and as a Terra captain, it becomes very good. This thing is definitely worse than Mega Steelix, but Revavroom I think is better than that. Steelix is worse than Bronzong. You're drafting Revavroom as like a Terra offensive option, and that's pretty much it. The defensive profile, I picked this thing because it was like one time, like round 3 when the gen first came out. I was like, oh, it's a grounded poison. It's got T-spikes. The defensive profile is okay. It's got filter. It switches in. It's got parting shot. What isn't there to love? Everything. It's not bulky enough. The defensive typing is super cool, but it's not like amazing. You definitely quad resist fairy, but its Spadef is really bad, so you're still taking like 40 from a lot of Moonblast or Hyper Voices, and coverage is definitely going to be ruining you. But I think this thing is super good on its own. As an offensive threat, and especially as a Terra captain. So it's definitely a really good high tier budget option. It's a high tier within the budget option tier, rather. It's definitely one of the better ones. Next up, we have Orthworm, and this is a hot take, but this Pokemon is bottom of the barrel through and through. It's so frail on the special side, but the Coil sets and Earth Eater plus Spikes access make this Pokemon like very much so draftable. Well, more so than these other guys. Definitely at the bottom of the budget. Then, I think it's worse than like Copperajah and Fortress and all these guys. Eskev is also probably worse than Fori, but still, I mean, like, it's still really bad because it's like it doesn't switch into types that you want a Steel type to switch into on the special side. Earth Eater is really nice, but that's still just like it's a boon to it for sure. It makes it definitely better than you would think. And especially with Shed Tail, man. If Shed Tail's allowed, then it becomes like a B tier Steel type for sure. But in my opinion, that should be banned always. So yeah, I don't think that Earthworm is very much a good choice. I'm actually going to cover Zamacrown. I think this Pokemon is banned most of the time, but if it's not, it's like the GOAT. It's like up there with Scizor, obviously. I think it's one of the most fucking annoying Pokemon to face in prep and should never be allowed. I'll put it up in GOAT status, probably ahead of Scizor. But if we're considering the fact that it's banned most of the time, it definitely should just stay down here. I may as well just talk about it, though. I'll put it on the final list as the actual greatest, but I think it should be banned for sure. Next up, we have Gambit. If we're talking with Terra and everything, Gambit is a very good piece. I've seen it Terra banned in that decks for sure, but I'm thinking like if it's not Terra banned, then it's up here. Like if it's a Terra captain, and it's able to Omni Terra and it has like Pursuit and Knockoff and everything, I'm sorry, Celesteela, but you kind of get outmatched by Gambit. I still think like Mawile is better, but Gambit's very centralizing and being able to run any type on it makes it fucking amazing. So Omni Terra on Gambit with cut moves allowed, very much so a fucking horrifying prospect. Next up, we have Treads. And as much as I want to put actually, I will put Treads up here because it does do the offensive roles pretty well. I'm actually going to move Jirachi to solid defensive profile because more so, it's going to be a defensive piece. It's not going to be offensive most of the time. I think the offensive sets are definitely slept on, but it's not that potent anymore because it is pretty weak power corrupt wise. Like if you're not setting up a store power or Calm Mind, you're not going to be hitting very hard. But Treads with booster energy, attack or booster speed, rapid spin, choice band sets, the offensive typing is really good. It makes it better, than Drill in that aspect because its defensive profile is way better than Drill's. People again over rely on Treads for a lot, but I still think that it can be relied on for a lot of things. And then finally we have Goldingo, which is very, very hard to place, but in my opinion is another S tier Steel type. And that's because of the ability in tandem with the typing, in tandem with the offensive move pool. Very strong Pokemon, very solid. Scarf or Spexer, it has really good utility moves. And the ability is super, super good. So I think Goldingo is definitely one of the greatest Steel types and one of the better ones they've added. I think it's definitely better than Heatran, as well as Treads is better than Heatran. And I think it definitely, to go over it, Goat, these two, Zama, if it's allowed, is better than anything else on the list. Roll balance, Mawile, I think, is still very, very much so strong in that dex. The power creep hasn't caught up to this thing yet, and I don't think it will for a long time. Then we have Gambit. Again, considering just Terra, I think Gambit is incredible. So that is good. Melmetal, Celesteela does both autotomize and defensive leech seed with its typing. Melmetal, especially with Terra access, is very, very good. Goldingo is well rounded offensively and defensively. It does that stuff very well in matchups. Shreds is just utility, but like booster attack spin and choice spin, and it's a pretty decent choice scarfer. It can run like special sets, so it does both. It's not as strong offensively, but I still think it does it well enough to be put in the S tier because I can't imagine putting it down here with these guys. I think it's better than all four of these Pokemon. Heatran does what it's done since it came out, especially with like stuff like boots, and it's got a very good offensive profile because of its special attack. Drill is Drill. It's especially with Terra access. I think Drill in that dex is amazing and is definitely underrated, even in a Pal Dex context. Jirachi does what it does, forces item prep. It does everything. It's like it got like Wish and Healing Wish and screens and stuff, and rocks. Ferrothorn's a very good hazard setter. It's a very good pivot into a lot of things. It's just really solid. It got a very good defensive profile. Aggron's very underrated. It switches into everything and has coverage out the ass and is strong too, so it's kind of hard to switch into. Corviknight's a really good pivot and is better in that dex than Paldex. Kartana, very centralizing mon in the builder, but has no defensive utility whatsoever. Scizor has just enough bulk to be passable defensively, but is definitely drafted way more in an offensive context. Aegislash has been power crept pretty badly, but still pretty good, functions very well. Ticketon has good roll compression, but shouldn't be leaned on too hard. Very good mid tier and is solid enough despite being passive. It still has stuff like Encore and Thunderwave. Metagross, very strong. The buffs they gave it make it much better, especially in a NatDex context. Cobalion, very balanced mid tier, good offensively and defensively. Lucario, purely offensive, but a very solid Terra captain that puts it so high up in the mid tier category. Same thing with Stakataka, very good. Although once it Terras, it's actually more balanced and very, very much functional in that aspect as a rocker or something like that, but needs Terra to be placed this high up on the list. One of the best abusers of Terra on the entire list. Empoleon, 4-move slot syndrome is really bad for it, but it is still good at what it does. It's a jack of all trades, master of none. Klefki, priority, prankster, stuff like spikes and screens make this Pokemon very good utility-wise and priority defog, but it's not bulky enough to be considered a very solid mid-tier, and actually Skarmory is probably better because it has a much more solid defensive profile, and that Steel Flying typing is super good. Registeel. Registeel is bulky, sponges hits for days, rest talk sets are really good, Iron Defense Body Press make it better than some of the other Pokemon below it. Goodra, it's a sponge, and the Iron Defense Body Press sets are super good on it too, and its coverage is very, very solid, making it a pretty good mid-tier and a balanced one at that. Magnezone functions super well as a trapper and a mid-tier Terra abuser. It's pretty solid Scarfer, and the dual stab is really hard to switch into. Analytic and Sturdy are both really nice additions to its kit. Bisharp is easily the best budget option. It has coverage and is a really good abuser of Terra. Bronzong, power crept to hell and back, but Levitate is still a very valuable tool, and it's still a good defensive piece and can function as your only steel type, although it's going to be stretched pretty thin. Revavroom is a pretty decent budget option. It's a good grounded poison and a very, very solid abuser of Terra. Mega Steelix is a very underrated Pokemon that functions well as both a steel and a ground type. With Sand Up, it hits pretty fucking hard and is super solid defensively. It's like Mega Aggron Light. Duraludon with the Violate becomes much more draftable. It's a very good utility Pokemon. It's very good using like body press sets, and it's a pretty decent low tier 3-4 point rocker. Doublade is very much slept on. The Ghost Steel typing is really nice. It's pretty solid SD setup. Pokemon Sneak is really nice, and Gyro Ball super strong. Very, very much so slept on, although being knockoff bait puts it pretty down low on the list in the budget options. Durant is pure offense, but the speed tier is super nice and it's got really good coverage, can be a potentially good abuser of Terra as well. Steelix is like Mega Steelix with an item slot and much worse special bulk. Very much arguable to be placed higher up, but I put it down so low because its special defense leaves a lot to be desired, but still functions well as a ground and a steel type. Forretress tries to do a lot, but really doesn't do anything well besides stack hazards and Volt Switch. Pretty much just functions as a pivot into physical attackers that sets up rocks. Escavalier doesn't have any of the utility of the choices above it, but it is a very strong offensive Pokemon and is a really good secondary steel option offensively. So it gets placed in the budget list, although albeit low because everything else above it either does the offensive roles better, like Doublade and Revavroom and Bisharp, or is a better defensive steel type because they have access to hazards, i.e. Forretress and Steelix. Copperajah gets placed below everyone else because it's just not bulky enough as a steel type. Very offensively scary, and if it can come in choice bend for free, a sheer force boosted, its sheer force boosted coverage, as well as having something like a full power heavy slam off of its high 120 attack is nice, but it doesn't really have the utility of a steel type. It doesn't have the defensive profile or anything like that, and needs an assault vest to switch in on a lot of things, which means you don't get the access to the rocks. Earthworm is just way too frail on the special side. Earth Eater gives it enough utility, but it's a decent spiker. But besides that, it doesn't really do much. It dies to every special hit on the planet. Togedemaru is easily the best of the shitty steel types, the extremely like the bottom of the barrel steel types that you would pick pretty much just because you want their defensive profile. Quad resisting flying and access to magnet rise with a good speed tier, and it has stuff like Super Fang and U-turn, which is really good. Iron Barbs is nice, and Spiky Shield makes it pretty good and formidable. And it has, albeit very low HP, it is one of the few steel types with access to Wish. I think only it and Jirachi actually get Wish on this list, which is pretty sick. Magneton, you pretty much just get it as a Terra abuser with like to trap steals. That's pretty much all I've drafted it for in Gen 9 anyway, especially in that dex. But it does that job very effectively. It's a pretty good Scarfer and has good offensive utility. The steel typing is pretty much just a side effect of it being of its own design. Alolan Sandslash gets drafted pretty much just exclusively on snow teams. It's a pretty good abuser of Terra on those, and it hits pretty hard. Ice Shard access makes it a lot better, plus it gets Rock Spin and Spike, so you can't be awful if you have all three of those. You can't be undraftable anyway, unless your name is Delibird, which doesn't get rocks. Berserker, it's a good like 2-point Terra captain because of Steelworker, but besides that, very much so almost undraftable because its defensive profile is non-existent. Klinklang, better than Berserker for sure. Don't know why I had it there. Shift gear and stuff. It has a decent enough defensive profile and gets momentum. Aggron has stuff like Terra Rock, Head Smash is a good choice band abuser, and it's like sturdy rocks and can explode. So it's pretty solid as a low tier, bottom of the barrel option as a secondary Pokemon, and it functions very, very, very well as a flying resist for like 2 or 3 points. Probopass is a good abuser of Terra. It's better than Aggron. Even with Head Smash. It's got like rocks pivoting. It's actually better than Berserker too. It's a good abuser of Terra for like 2 or so points. Sliggoo is only really good in Terra context. It like sponges hits pretty well, and it's like good as like a Terra option for like 1 point. Bastiodon's good with Terra and has a good profile defensively. I think it's actually probably better than Sliggoo, especially if Omni Terra's on the table. Has stuff like Body Press, and it got Foul Play this generation, which is really nice. Stunfisk is only here because it's a ground type. It can pretty much force prep from high tier electrics. And then everything down here, I've pretty much said my piece on them. There's not much more detail worth going into on these Pokemon. They're in the order they are. Look back on their segments individually for their summation. But that is the final list. And yeah, thank you for watching. I highly appreciate it. My first ever really long form video that isn't a Draft League movie. So hope you enjoyed it. And I appreciate you watching. If you liked it, make sure to like and subscribe, and check out my other socials in the description. Thank you. Have a good day.